We're going to have a very interesting interview today, Energy Media readers, because we're going to be talking to Tony Seba, who is the founder of RethinkX, a think tank based in California. And he and a co-author have just put out a paper that is staggering in its breadth and will rock your world in terms of what they're proposing. This is world history writ large and where we're going as a species, literally. So, Tony, welcome to the interview.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I have to tell you, I was very intrigued when I got the press release for your new work. And it is on a gargantuan scale. Nobody does world history anymore or world analysis as a rule, but you have, and I don't know how to describe it, so I'm going to let you give us an interview of what you're arguing.
Yeah, so, the summary is that, we're on the cusp of one of the fastest, deepest, and most consequential transformation of civilizations in history. During the 2020s, we are going to have a convergence of technologies in the 5 fundamental sectors of the economy: energy, information, transportation, food, and materials. And with them, of course, because these are the foundational sectors, everything in the 2020s is going to be disrupted. We're going to have 10x lower costs in these 5 sectors. And they're going to use 90% fewer resources and also produce 10 to 100 times less waste. Now, what does that mean? Production is not going to be the same, meaning this is not another industrial revolution. The way that we produce things is going to dramatically change. So everything, it's like the internet, everything will be networked, distributed, production will be local, resilient. Think about craft breweries rather than the big, oil plants or coal plants or whatever. Think craft breweries and rooftop solar, and that connected through the internet, that gives you an idea of how everything pretty much will be produced. And that is going to disrupt today's centralized, hierarchical, and fragile system. So when the production model changes, and that's what we're calling a creation age, because it's going to be all about creation, and I'll explain that. We're going to have to transform our organizing system. So every time that you have a way of producing things, and over the last 10,000 years, it's been all about extraction. So our production system has been about extracting things from nature and about exploitation of people. So extract and exploit. So that's been the last 10,000 years. Now it's going to be about creation of things, food, energy, transport, etc., and about freedom. And that's why we call it the age of freedom. And I can pause here if you have questions.
Well, I do have some questions, actually, because I don't think that most folks understand the depth to which the complexity of the technology change in all of those areas, and how I often say on the energy front, buckle up, the 2020s is going to be the age of disruption. It's going to be, this is going to be the big change. Now, I find it interesting that you talk about it writ large and the other 4 sectors of the economy. So let's talk about creation. And I know in your press release, you were talking about, instead of like material inputs, we're going to be talking about atoms and molecules and DNA. And could you explain that, please?
Yeah, so I will use the example of food. So the big picture is that, the last 10,000 years have been about material extraction and breaking them down. So we take something, whether it's stone or steel or a cow, and we chop it up and we extract what we want from them, throw out the rest, and consume what we want. What we're going to have going forward is different. So let's compare the cow, right? Livestock, which takes about 40% of the land mass of the US to produce cows today so that we can have our proteins, with the technology that is going to disrupt it, which we call precision fermentation. So what is precision fermentation? It's brewing, right? We've brewed beer for a long time. Essentially, what we're gonna do is, instead of making growing cows that will make proteins for us, say in dairy or in meat, we're gonna take the same microorganisms that make those proteins inside the cow and have those microorganisms produce the proteins in a fermentation tank. Actually, this is not new. Industrial fermentation is a $100 billion industry. And we make a ton of proteins with industrial fermentation. You know, the Impossible Burger, for instance. The protein that gives those burgers the taste is heme, is a protein that is fermented, right? It's created. So why is this disruptive? Precision fermentation has basically gone down in cost since the year 2000. So in the year 2000, a PF protein was $1 million per kilo. Today, it's $100 per kilo. So it's gone down by about 10,000 times in cost. Now, why is this interesting? Take that cost curve into the future, and by 2024 or 5, the cost of making proteins, the same proteins that go into milk, casein, whey, collagen, and so on, are gonna cost $10 per kilo, which is going to be the same as the cost of, as today's cost of those proteins. So instead of, you know, taking a cow, growing it for 3 years, and so on and so forth, 3% of milk by volume is proteins. That's all, right? We can make those proteins in a fermentation tank 10 to 25 times more efficient than with a cow, right? So we don't have to produce all the waste and whatever. But on a purely economic basis, it means that by 2030, the cost of making proteins via precision fermentation will be 80% lower than with the cow.
Now, I have a question around manufacturing, because since the rise of 3D printing, I've often wondered if it will get to the cost point where you could produce car parts locally, you could produce other kinds of consumer goods, and all come out of a 3D printer, depending on the, you know, the CAD/CAM file or whatever it was you fed into it. Is that where we're going around goods manufacturing?
So it's a similar idea that we're going to produce things locally from the bottom up rather than breaking things down. We're actually going to use, whether it's nanotechnology, we're going to use DNA, we're going to use molecules, we're going to use the photons and electrons to make things and to run things, rather than the big steel and so on. We're going to do things from the bottom up. And 3D printing is one way to do that, but essentially food is going to be done that way, information and energy and so on. So think about the fact that we're going to make pretty much everything. So design and development will be done globally over information networks, but production and distribution will be done locally at the city level and regional level and so on. So we're going to have regions and cities that are going to become self-sufficient in terms of our basic needs: food, energy, transport, and so on.
I think that's one of the most interesting arguments that you've got. because essentially the political institutions and structures that we have will follow the economic changes. And so if we have regional economies, regional production and creation, then we will have regional governments, whether it be little mini states or city states or whatever they might be. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so the systems that we have, the governance systems and the production systems, can be thought of as centralized. We have a centralized government, whether it's Ottawa or Washington or Beijing and so on. We have centralized production, whether it's oil or gas or cows or whatever. And then we have hierarchical kind of governance. That way, you basically have one person on top, and then it's like a pyramid, right? It's no coincidence that it's like a pyramid, which goes back thousands of years. But as the production system goes local, all of it, right? As cities and regions become independent in terms of producing almost everything that we need, then what do we need the center for, right? So essentially our governance systems are going to have to be more distributed, just like production systems are going to be distributed on the edge. It's what we call network and the node. We're all going to be connected. We're all going to design things over the web. We're all going to share information and knowledge, but production is going to be local and robust and resilient and so on. And that is going to require a new governance system, what we call organizing system, to reorganize society. So what is happening today is that the world is already going that way with the internet, for instance. We're already, all networked. We're all creating content from everywhere and we're distributing it everywhere. So it's the first sector, information, that's being disrupted. So we're already there, going there. And that's going to be the shape of production systems to come in energy, transport, and food, and so on, right? Now that, at the same time that it's making us essentially more independent locally, it's also, ironically, compounding the collapse of the old system, because our centralized system cannot cope with an internet, a networked economy. And one of the sad instances of how that happens is how essentially our political system can be hijacked by a couple of hackers in a foreign country, and you can enable regime change without firing a single bullet. And that's how disruptions happen.
Well, this will be the last question, Tony, and it's timeline. So I understand the 2020s will be a period of disruption. I can certainly see the logic behind that argument, but that doesn't mean that in 2030 we're going to magically have transitioned into this new age of freedom that you talk about. So how long between the time when we get disrupted until the time when you think that we will have more or less have evolved these new structures and new means of creation?
So by 2030, the production system will take us there. Energy will be 10x cheaper. Transport will be 10x cheaper. Food is going to be cheaper and so on. So the technology is going to take us there. What is going to require a lot of work is the new organizing system. And today's centralized system doesn't work. Everything that we have today was created to manage the industrial order, right? But it doesn't work in this new network and node kind of age. So we're going to need to make choices, experiment with new organizing systems, with a new set of governance systems and so on. So many of the things that came out of the industrial order, the nation state, representative democracy, and so on and so forth, may not work in the 2030s. So we need to make those choices and experiment. So we need thousands of cities around the world to start experimenting with new governance systems so that we can all govern our system better in the 2030s. We can have one of two things in the 2030s. I mean, assuming we don't collapse in the 2020s, which is a big if, we can have a production system that delivers everything we need, a lot cheaper, environmentally safer, and so on. But it could be either beneficial or it could be dystopian. The beneficial version is if we find a way to own the networks, for instance, to manage society, to manage a new democratic system, and so on. The dystopian version is if we have a handful of companies owning the network. I mean, imagine Facebook, which manages the information networks, owning also the food networks and the transport networks and the energy networks, right? So you have one company or five managing both your production and your organizing system and your governance. That is dystopian. I mean, that is when we get into the, well, it may not be better than we have now.
Well, Tony, since the 2020s are going to be disruptive, we agree on that. I look forward to checking back with you regularly to see just how much we've been disrupted and whether we're heading towards a dystopian system or this new utopia that will be better than what we have. So thank you very much for this. Much appreciated.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.